What's going on, YouTube? I've been thinking a lot lately about how I can explain things to help other trackers understand some things and things that I've learned that have helped me become a better tracker. So the person that I learned to track from, they mostly hunt, Maine or Canada, and the bucks there are just built different than the bucks here in the Adirondacks where I live. I hunt in Massachusetts, it's the same kind of thing. The thing I want to talk about the most is like picking out a buck track, not just based on his sole size of his track. A buck that I saw his track in Maine, he had, an unbelievably large track. And he was probably only a 2.5 or 3. He wasn't over 3.5, let's say that. He still walked on the points of his feet, kind of pranced. But that track that I saw there was as big as the biggest buck track that I've seen in the Adirondacks. But it was just a young deer there. It's just they're just this different subspecies of whitetail. I changed the way that I picked the buck track since 2017. And the buck that changed my mind. So in 2017, I'm out looking for, a good buck, a 200 plus pounder is what I'm really looking for, or was at the time. But in the Adirondacks, there's not a whole lot of them. I might have only found 1 or 2 tracks the whole year. So I find this buck track, and he wasn't a buck that I normally follow just because he didn't have a very wide stance. I thought I would have thought he was a younger buck. But after I got following him for a little bit, in the first 100 yards, he stuck his nose in the snow to feed. And so this is 16 inches, like pinky to pinky, so I know that. And he was 4 inches outside both sides of it. And there's 4 or 5 inches of snow. And he was so tall that he left rack marks above the hole as well as his main beam. Like his tines were so tall, they were rubbing in front of the hole, which I was like, holy cow, man, this is just a monster as far as rack wise goes. But he wasn't a very heavy deer, I don't think. I think he was probably in that 160 to 170 pound range. And I followed him for a couple miles. I never caught him. It was in early November when they're really traveling. And man, he stayed away long ways out around trees. So that was the buck that changed my mind, and I started paying more attention to something that Lanny had taught me, and that is that when a buck gets to be that 4.5 year age range, he starts walking more on the back, the hind of his, I'm going to say feet, I understand it's a hoof, but for all intents and purposes, I'm just going to call it a foot. So when they're 2.5 or 3.5, they kind of walk on the fronts of their feet. Most of the pressure is on the front side of their foot. And when they start getting to be that 4+ years, they start walking more on the flat of their foot. And they get that 5+, they get to be 5, 6, 7, 8 or whatever. They're really heavy walking. And I'm just talking about walking. I'm not talking about running. I'm talking about strictly walking, really walking on the flats of their feet. And I started following bucks more based on that, just trying to kill an older age class buck. Because just the sole size of their track or their stagger isn't enough for where I hunt in the Adirondacks or some of these areas. I'm assuming Vermont's the same because we're pretty close. Massachusetts was definitely the same way. Don't get me wrong, there's some huge buck tracks out there, but they're few and far between. And I really just want to go track down mature bucks. It's the only reason I followed that first buck that I tracked this year. I spent, I went 5 days. That was the 5th day before I picked that track to go follow. And the reason I followed him was because he was a real heavy flat footer, really walked on the backs of his feet. And usually within a couple hundred yards, so within a couple hundred yards, I really know what the buck is. And that's important. Because you want to know the buck that you're tracking, you want to shoot. In my early years, I'd want to track down, I'd want to see him, I'd want to look at him first before I'd want to get a look at him before I determined whether I was going to kill him or not. And that was a mistake for this reason. I don't get to jump a lot of mature, I see guys that jump mature bucks time and time again before they kill them. I've never had that happen in my experience. Usually 2 to 3 times is all I get jumping like a real mature buck. He's not messing around. And when I jump him after that like 3rd time, he's running like across the county. I mean, he's going 3 or 4 miles. So when they get that far out in front of you, it's hard to catch them. Don't get me wrong, like there's been chances where I jumped a buck a 4th time or something. But really, if you don't kill him that 1st or 2nd time in the 1st or 2nd encounter, your chances go down significantly. So that buck that I got on this year, that's how I picked him. He wouldn't have been a normal buck that I'd tracked in the past. But I knew he was an older deer just because he walked on the flats with feet, and I think that's more important than anything else, in my opinion, at this point in time in my tracking career. So within like, usually within 200 yards or so, sometimes not even, I can determine whether this is a buck that I want to hunt or not just by the way he walks in the woods. Literally how he walks around trees or where he chooses to walk, because he doesn't want to get his rack hung up in, he doesn't want to get his rack hung up in trees or whatever. So he takes the easiest path. And you wouldn't think that like he'd be worried about this, tree limbs or whatever, but they just avoid it. I'm not really sure the reason, but they definitely do. So I knew this buck had a good rack. I'm going to tell some other stories about some other bucks, but for right now we're going to stick to this one because this is the newest one. And I think deer hunting stories are helpful. I like listening to other people's deer hunting stories. I like watching other people's stuff on YouTube. I'm always trying to learn or get an edge on something. So the first time I jumped him, he's with this doe, but I know he's got a good rack on him. He left some rack marks in the snow where his main beam stuck in. And so when I jumped him the first time, I can hear his rack going through the woods, which is, that's a pretty good sign that he's got something on his head that like it's just smashing off trees. Then I get going on his track a while later, and he turns a front foot just enough that he can stick his rack. He turned his foot just enough that he can stick his rack between 2 trees. And these trees were probably 16 or 17 inches wide. So if he's turning his front foot to fit his head through there, I know he's wider than that. 16 or 17 inch wide thing. So I know he's got a pretty good rack on him, but I kind of knew that anyways, just by the way he carried himself in the woods and how far away he walked away from trees on either side. So when I got out into that big swale, and he comes running out, he was just a smasher rack. He was, he's a buck in the 150 plus range, and that's just a huge rack, especially for the Adirondacks, or in my opinion, the Northeast, like 150 inch deer is big. He might have been 160, but I'm just going to say he was 150 plus inches. Big, wide, big long main beams. And they have long main beams because when you see the main beams come out past the end of the nose, as they're broadside, you see that main beam come out toward the end of the nose. That's a long main beam on a deer. Now these big old bucks, when they get to be like that, I think like that 6+ year old deer, they're like another animal. Survival is their #1 priority. So even when they're with does, the doe beds, and they're back in the woods somewhere or beyond them, they're always putting that doe in front of them and putting themselves in safety. I always find it that way. That second buck that I took a shot at this year, he was a younger buck, probably like 4 or 5 would be my guess. He was just starting to be a flat footer. He wasn't real heavy flat footed. And he was like, so if he was an 8-point, he was something in the, high 120s. If he was a 10-point, then he was something in the higher 130s for score wise. And I knew this buck when I was tracking him. I was like, man, he's got himself in a bad spot. He was with a younger doe, and she's not real skittish yet, and she had him kind of out in the open. Most of these big bucks that are, the 6+ years old, they push the does into some place they want. Like, they don't let them hang out in some wide open place. They're pushing them down into some terrible stuff to hang out with them and guard them. That's where they want to be. They know. They've already learned that lesson. They don't want to be caught out somewhere in the wide open. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying the probability isn't great. I really try to think about some of the things that I made mistakes on when I was younger. When I say younger, I didn't start tracking until I was, oh, I don't even know how old I would have been. I think I was in probably my, well, I say tracking, when I say tracking, I mean picking out a buck, solely one buck, and tracking him to hunt him. Now, did I track previous to that? Yes, I would go get on deer tracks and follow the tracks and sneak up on deer, and I would kill, you know, I killed bucks that way, and does. But I wasn't specifically tracking one deer or sorting him out to go hunt him specifically. It was just, here's some tracks, we got fresher snow. It made sense to follow them to where they were going and try to sneak up on them to see if one of them was a buck. So I started tracking in, trying to think, the early 2000s, so probably, I mean, 20 years ago, I guess. So I'm 46 now, so I guess I was 26 or so when I first started tracking and trying to sort out some bucks. Some of the things that I did in the beginning that I'd mess up on is definitely going too fast. Like, I'd get on a buck track and I'd just keep following it. I wasn't paying attention to when he was slowing down, when he was doing something different. I didn't really know, like, hey, he should be right here. And that's something you kind of have to learn. You got to follow some tracks and really pay attention to what's going on. But going too fast is probably one of the biggest things that I made a mistake doing. Killed some bucks going too fast, but there was a lot of luck involved. Going slower when you should be going slower, probability-wise, is much better. So the guy that taught me, you know, that taught me how to track, it's just completely different than the Adirondacks or a lot of big country that I hunt now and did back then too. The fact that there's not roads everywhere, most of it's just big country, you know, big woods, big country. There might be hiking trails, there might not be hiking trails, but there's no roads. So be able to go ride roads to go find where the deer are or what's around for big bucks, to go scout, all has to be done on foot. And I really only just want to kill, I just want to kill like really big bucks. I want to kill something that's really 6+ years old. That's really what I'm after. Like I said, I'm 46 years old, so I don't know how much longer my body will hold up for me to be able to go do that. So fail or not, that's strictly what I've been doing. Is just trying to kill a big buck, and if I don't go do that, I just soon fail at that than be successful killing a smaller buck. And that's just my preference. It doesn't matter what anybody else does. That's just my preference of what I want to do. I like to go find nut trees that are dropping nuts, and some are good. You know, if you find these places, you can go back to them year after year. They're not good every year, but I'm always going back to see if they have nuts, the nuts on, to see if I'll be able to go look for tracks there for the year. So my favorite time to track deer is Thanksgiving week on. They're kind of after that early on November rut where they're just walking miles and miles and miles and miles, and when you go find a track, he's already 10 miles ahead of you when you start on him. You don't catch a lot of deer. So now I really only try to find bucks that are going to get hung up with a doe that I know I'm going to catch up with. So I primarily go to like doe bedding areas, Doe Yards. By that time, you know, by the end of November, the does are really all in their doe groups. So anyways, Doe Yards. That's primarily why I want to go pick up buck tracks. They roam through there, and this is the other thing. Later in the season, I'm getting to pick through tracks and sort tracks, really looking for that flat footer. And he might be a buck that's from 10 miles away that I wouldn't have ever normally found. But when they get out roaming and they get in these big, usually they're in valleys where I do find the bucks. They're in spruce bottoms or cedar swamps or cedar bottoms. I know a lot of trackers talk about not liking to go into those places, and it's definitely more difficult. But that's where the does are seemingly. Not that they're not up on tops, but they really seem to yard in these areas that are in bottoms for what I find, majority of. So that's where I want to go in the morning. I go there. I might drive to a couple doe yards. I might go to one, walk around a bunch of it, go to a couple of them, because sometimes they're a half mile apart. I go check a couple of them out. If I don't find a buck I want, I go back to my vehicle, drive to another one, go check that one out. And it just allows me to sort. I get to sort more bucks at the end of the year because they're really out traveling. Then, like I said, I'm probably hunting most of these bucks could be from 10 miles away. I don't really know where they are. They don't live right there because I do not find them in the earlier November. So it has to be a later season thing. One of the biggest problems in the beginning was I had to take, I'd take a vacation. So I'd be like, oh, I take this week vacation. Of course, you got to put in it for months in advance in order to have it. And there'd be no snow. Well, that hurts things. And then you're stuck to tracking on the weekends. So if you're not going hunting on a killing day, or if you're not going tracking on a killing day, you are really limiting your chances. And by killing day, I mean, let's say it snows, the whole day previous, and then you get a night for it to sit. And I call it marinate. I let the snow marinate so it collects tracks, marinating tracks. So that following day is what I consider like a killing day. Maybe the day after too. The snow's still pretty soft and fluffy. It's probably not crunchy. If there's some wind, that's even better. It just seems like after a storm, that following day after a storm, there's still some wind blowing. There's still some kind of like blustery conditions, and that really helps cover your sound. And that's what I consider a killing day. I've heard Joe Donito speak of it as, he calls it a snow day. I've just called it a killing day because that's what it is to me. I know when the snow's on like that, and the next couple days after it they're killing days. They're days that you have the odds in your favor, or more in your favor than other days for sure. If you get that early, you get enough early snow, it pushes them out of the mountains into these bottoms. And those big bucks, don't get me wrong, they stay up on top of those mountains, but at night they come down and check out those does. And that's where I want to go to try to find, a big buck track. Is I'm going to go in there and walk these doe yards looking for a good buck track, and hopefully he's found one, and I can go follow him with her. That's where I'm at right now. That's where I've been for the last 5 years. And this year I tracked 8 days in the snow. I say tracked, I only tracked 2 bucks in 8 days. That doesn't mean I didn't follow some bucks around or look at some bucks, or I followed them a little ways, decided they weren't anything that I wanted to hunt. But in 8 days of tracking, I got shots at two big bucks. The first one being the biggest buck that I would have ever killed in the Adirondacks or New York State. I can't stress enough how important it is to go tracking on the days of the killing snow. It's just a huge thing. Better take a sick day, a couple sick days, whatever you got to do to get out and go hunt those days. If you're just learning tracking, you better be out this time of year when it's not, it's January right now, the end of January. You better be out this time of year following buck tracks around and trying to learn all you can. Because there's snow right now. You better get out and just walk around and look at all the tracks and follow all the tracks you can. Hopefully you found something useful and something that I've said, or learned some little trick that helps you out anyways. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll try to answer them the best I can.